You can turn $10,000 into $100,000 and still end up broke. You can follow every investment strategy perfectly and lose everything. The difference isn't luck or timing or market knowledge. It's something that happens before you ever touch a single dollar of investment capital, and missing this step is why most people fail even when they do everything else right. This video isn't about investment tactics or wealth hacks or finding the next opportunity. It's about understanding why trying to grow money before you understand money is like trying to run before you can walk, except the fall costs you years of your life and potentially everything you've saved. By the end, you'll see exactly why awareness comes before action, why self-control precedes growth, and why the people who build lasting wealth spend more time understanding than doing. This content is for educational purposes only. It does not constitute financial advice. The goal here is understanding, not instruction. Here's what nobody talks about in the wealth building space. Two people start with the same amount of money, $10,000 saved. Person A immediately looks for ways to grow it, reads about stocks, crypto, real estate, side businesses, takes action fast. Person B does something that seems wasteful. They spend 6 months just tracking where their existing money goes, understanding their relationship with spending, examining their financial patterns. No growth moves at all. Just observation and awareness. 5 years later, Person B has built substantial wealth across multiple areas. Person A, they've been through 3 different strategies, lost money twice, made it back once, and they're basically where they started, maybe slightly ahead but exhausted and confused. You've probably seen this pattern. Maybe you're Person A, wondering why your attempts to grow wealth keep stalling out or backfiring. The assumption seems obvious: if you have money, you should make it grow. Letting it sit while you just understand things feels like wasting time. But here's what makes this truly strange. Person A knows more about investment vehicles than Person B. They understand stock fundamentals, they know about compound interest, they can explain different strategies. Person B knows less about external opportunities, but something else entirely. They understand themselves. And that difference, that understanding of self versus understanding of opportunities, determines everything that happens next. But why? The answer reveals something about money that changes how you see every financial decision you'll ever make. The problem starts with a backwards assumption built into almost all financial education. The assumption is that knowledge about money leads to success with money. Learn about investing, learn about markets, learn about opportunities, and you'll build wealth. But there's a step that comes before all of that, a foundation that most people skip entirely. Because it seems too basic or too slow or not actionable enough. Understanding money before trying to grow it means something specific, something most people never do. It means understanding how money moves through your life right now before you try to make it multiply. Think about what happens when someone gets $10,000 and immediately tries to grow it. They look outward. Where can I put this? What's the best return? What should I invest in? All external questions, but they don't look inward. Why do I spend the way I spend? What emotional needs am I meeting with money? What patterns repeat in my financial life? Where does money leak out of my system without me noticing? These internal questions feel less urgent, less productive. But skipping them is why growth attempts fail, and the reason is something most advice completely ignores. Hold on to this because it connects to everything else. Your brain has a relationship with money that formed over decades, starting in childhood. Every interaction with money, every conversation your parents had about it, every time you felt scarcity or abundance or shame or power around money, your brain was learning, building neural pathways, creating automatic responses. By the time you're an adult trying to grow wealth, you have a sophisticated unconscious system that determines how you actually behave with money, regardless of what you consciously know you should do. Here's the mechanism. When you try to grow money without understanding this system, you're building on a broken foundation. You might make money in an investment, but if your unconscious relationship with money says spending creates relief from anxiety, you'll find ways to spend those gains. You might save aggressively, but if your unconscious pattern says money should flow out as fast as it flows in, you'll create emergencies or obligations that drain your accounts. You might learn perfect strategies, but if your psychological wiring around money is misaligned, the strategies won't stick. This isn't character weakness. This is predictable neurology. Your unconscious patterns around money are stronger than your conscious knowledge about money, and trying to grow wealth without addressing this imbalance is like trying to fill a bucket with holes in it. But there's more happening here than just psychology, and this is where most people's understanding completely breaks down. There's a structural reason why understanding must come before growth, a mathematical reality that nobody explains clearly. Remember when I said this connects to everything else? Here's where it matters. Money is a system flowing through your life. Income comes in, expenses go out, some amount stays or grows or shrinks. Most people focus on the inputs and outputs, the amounts, without ever mapping the system itself. They don't know their burn rate, the actual speed at which money leaves their life. They don't know their friction points, the places where money disappears in ways that don't create value. They don't know their emotional triggers, the states that cause spending. They definitely don't know their wealth multiplication rate, how fast any money they keep actually compounds versus how fast their lifestyle inflates to consume gains. Without mapping this system, growth is random. You might increase income, but your burn rate increases faster and you end up more stressed with more money. You might invest successfully, but your friction points drain the gains before they compound. You might make $10,000 in the market, but your lifestyle inflation eats it within months and you don't even know where it went. The growth happened, but the system wasn't ready to hold it. Understanding money before trying to grow, it means mapping this system completely, seeing where every dollar goes, understanding why it goes there, recognizing the patterns that repeat. This feels tedious. It feels like it's not making progress, but it's the only thing that lets growth stick. Now, the financial advice industry will never emphasize this, and the reason exposes something uncomfortable about how advice gets packaged and sold. Advice about understanding yourself, mapping your system, building awareness, it doesn't scale into products. You can't sell a course on sitting with your discomfort around money. You can't create a subscription service for tracking your emotional spending triggers. You can sell investment courses, trading platforms, real estate systems, business blueprints. Those are concrete, actionable, they promise external results. Understanding is internal, slow, unsexy. So the advice you see everywhere focuses on what to do with money, not on understanding your relationship with it. This creates a predictable pattern. People consume advice, try to implement strategies, fail because the foundation isn't there, then consume more advice looking for a better strategy. The cycle repeats indefinitely. But the people who actually build lasting wealth, not people who get lucky once, but people who build and maintain wealth over decades, they all go through this understanding phase, sometimes consciously, often unconsciously. They develop what you might call financial self-knowledge. They know their patterns, they know their triggers, they know their weaknesses. They know their relationship with money at a granular level, and that self-knowledge shapes everything else they do. When they invest, they choose strategies that match their psychology. When they earn more, they have systems to prevent lifestyle inflation. When they experience gains, they understand the emotional patterns that might cause self-sabotage. The understanding came first. The growth came second, always in that order. Here's what this looks like in practice, and the math reveals why understanding matters more than strategy. Person A makes $50,000 annually. They learn about investing, they start putting money in the market, they're doing everything right according to standard advice. But they never map their system. They don't realize they spend $300 monthly on convenience because they're exhausted from poor time management. They don't realize they drain an extra $200 monthly on subscriptions they don't use because canceling things creates anxiety. They don't realize their discretionary spending doubles when they're stressed. Over a year, these unmapped leaks cost them $6,000. They could have invested that $6,000. Over 30 years at 7% return, that's over $450,000 in lost wealth, not from bad investments, from not understanding where their money was actually going. Person B makes the same $50,000. But they spend 6 months just tracking everything. They notice the convenience spending. They realize it's connected to time scarcity. They restructure their week to create more time, which reduces convenience spending to $50 monthly. They notice the subscription drain. They realize it's connected to decision fatigue. They create a quarterly review system. They notice the stress spending. They realize they need better stress management tools. They invest in therapy, which costs money short-term but reduces the stress spending long-term. After 6 months of understanding, they have a system that captures an extra $400 monthly. That's $4,800 annually. Over 30 years, that's over $360,000, even before considering any investment returns. The understanding created wealth even before any growth strategy. You might be thinking, okay, but can't you do both? Can't you grow money while also building understanding? And that seems logical, it seems efficient, but there's a trap here that catches almost everyone. Hold that thought, because what comes next explains why trying to do both simultaneously is worse than doing neither. When you try to grow money before you understand money, you create a specific psychological pattern that becomes harder to break over time. You associate wealth building with external action, finding opportunities, making moves, executing strategies. Your brain learns that progress feels like doing things. This sounds positive until you realize what it prevents. It prevents you from developing the internal awareness that determines whether external action actually works. You stay focused outward, always looking for the next opportunity, the next strategy, the next move. You never develop the ability to see your own patterns, your own sabotage, your own psychological barriers. Over years, you become someone who knows a lot about money and opportunities, but very little about yourself and your relationship with money. This leads to a strange outcome. You make progress, you lose progress, you make it again, you lose it again. The external knowledge is there, the internal foundation isn't. But when you build understanding first, something different happens in your brain. You develop what psychologists call metacognition, the ability to observe your own thinking and behavior. You can see yourself making emotional spending decisions and pause before executing. You can notice lifestyle inflation starting and course correct before it becomes habitual. You can recognize FOMO or fear or greed influencing financial choices and separate the emotion from the decision. This metacognitive ability is the actual foundation of wealth building. It's what lets growth compound instead of leaking away through unconscious patterns, and you can only develop it by prioritizing understanding over action, at least initially. Here's the mechanism at the neurological level. When you engage in financial awareness practices, tracking spending, examining emotional triggers, mapping patterns, you're building neural pathways in your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for executive function and self-regulation. When you engage in external action without this foundation, buying investments, chasing opportunities, making deals, you're activating reward circuits in your limbic system, the emotional center. The prefrontal cortex circuits make you capable of sustained wealth building. The limbic system circuits make you chase short-term gains and feel productive without building foundation. Which circuits you strengthen determines everything about your long-term financial outcomes. Understanding builds the right circuits. Action without understanding reinforces the wrong ones. Now let's track what happens over time, because the divergence reveals why this principle matters so profoundly. After 2 years, person A, who started trying to grow money immediately, has had some wins and some losses. Maybe they're up 20% on their initial capital. Maybe they've built a side income stream. They're seeing results, which reinforces that their approach works, but underneath, their unconscious money patterns haven't changed. They still have the same lifestyle inflation tendency, the same emotional spending triggers, the same friction points. The gains are real but fragile. Person B, who spent the first 6 months just building understanding, is now 18 months into actual growth strategies. But those strategies are built on solid foundation. They know their patterns, they have systems to prevent sabotage, they've addressed the psychological barriers. Their absolute returns might be similar to person A at this point, but their foundation is completely different. After 5 years, the gap becomes visible. Person A has been through multiple strategies, some worked, some didn't. They have more knowledge than ever about opportunities and tactics, but their net worth is maybe 30 to 40% higher than when they started. They're constantly fighting against themselves, against patterns they don't fully see. They make progress, then slide back. They feel like they're working hard but not getting proportional results. Person B's net worth might be up 80 to 100%, not from better opportunities or smarter tactics, from having systems that hold gains instead of leaking them away, from making decisions aligned with their actual psychology instead of fighting their nature, from building on foundation instead of sand. After 10 years, you're looking at completely different financial lives. Person A might have decent wealth, maybe their money doubled or tripled, but they're exhausted. They've churned through countless strategies. They don't trust themselves with money because they've self-sabotaged so many times. They have knowledge but not wisdom, tactics but not systems, information but not self-awareness. Person B might have wealth that's grown 5 times, 6 times, 7 times. Not from working harder or finding better opportunities, from having eliminated the unconscious barriers that prevent compound growth, from understanding their relationship with money so deeply that growth happens almost automatically because the system is designed to capture and multiply it. After 20 years, and this is where it becomes undeniable, person A might have built real wealth despite themselves. Maybe $400,000 to $600,000 if they maintained discipline and got reasonable returns. That's genuinely impressive, better than most people achieve. But the journey was painful, full of setbacks, self-sabotage, exhaustion, and there's a fragility to it. Their wealth is maintained through constant vigilance and effort because the underlying patterns never changed. Person B might have $1.2 million to $1.8 million. Same time frame, similar starting point, dramatically different outcome. The difference, understanding came first. The foundation was solid. Growth compounded on stability instead of fighting chaos. Let me show you what this looks like with specific numbers and a realistic scenario, because the abstraction hides the actual impact. James is 32. He has $15,000 saved. He's excited about building wealth, starts learning about investing, puts the money in a diversified portfolio, continues adding money monthly. Smart moves according to all standard advice. But James never mapped his system. He doesn't realize he spends $600 monthly on food delivery because he hates grocery shopping and meal planning. He doesn't realize he spends $400 monthly on entertainment and social activities that he doesn't actually enjoy but feels obligated to participate in. He doesn't realize he upgrades his phone, laptop, and other tech every time new versions come out because it makes him feel like he's keeping up. These patterns are invisible to him. They feel like just how life costs. Over 10 years, James invests consistently, gets reasonable 7% returns. His investments grow to around $170,000. Impressive. But those unmapped patterns cost him about $1,000 monthly, $12,000 annually. If he had mapped his system, understood those patterns, and redirected even half of that waste, he'd have an extra $6,000 annually to invest. That's over $83,000 in additional wealth over 10 years with compound returns. His net worth could have been $250,000 instead of $170,000. The difference isn't investment knowledge, it's self-knowledge, understanding versus action, foundation versus tactics. Now compare this to Maria. Same age, same starting capital, same general financial situation. But Maria spends 3 months tracking every dollar, examining every purchase, understanding the emotional states that drive spending. She discovers she spends $500 monthly on clothes she rarely wears because shopping soothes anxiety. She discovers she spends $300 monthly on wellness products and supplements because she's trying to solve health issues that actually need medical attention. She discovers she spends $200 monthly on courses and books she never completes because buying them feels like progress. Total waste, $1,000 monthly, same as James, but Maria sees it. She addresses the anxiety with therapy. She gets proper medical care for the health issues. She creates a learning system that involves finishing before buying. Within 6 months, she's reduced the waste to $200 monthly, redirecting $800 monthly toward investments. Over 10 years, Maria's initial $15,000 grows to similar levels as James from the market returns, but she's adding much more capital. The $800 monthly she reclaimed, invested consistently, becomes another $120,000. Her total wealth is closer to $290,000, not from better investment strategy, from understanding her money system first, from seeing the patterns that were draining wealth before trying to grow wealth. The understanding phase cost her 3 months. The payoff was worth over $120,000 across a decade. That's the math of why understanding must come before growth. You're probably wondering what this understanding process actually looks like in practice, what you're supposed to do during this phase before you start trying to grow money. And this is where most guidance fails because it tries to give you a one-size-fits-all system when understanding is inherently personal. But there are principles that work for everyone, patterns you need to map regardless of your specific situation. We'll get to those, but first you need to understand why most people resist this phase, even when they know it's important. The resistance comes from how our brains are wired to value visible progress over invisible foundation. When you invest money and see your account balance grow, your brain releases dopamine, visible progress, immediate feedback, tangible result. When you track spending and notice patterns, there's no immediate reward. You're just observing, no dopamine hit, no visible progress. Your brain interprets this as wasting time. This neurological bias toward visible action over invisible understanding is why most people skip the foundation phase. It doesn't feel productive, even though it's the most productive thing you could possibly do for long-term wealth. There's also an emotional component that most people don't recognize. Understanding your relationship with money requires confronting uncomfortable truths. Maybe you spend to avoid feeling things. Maybe you use money to solve problems that money can't actually solve. Maybe your financial behavior is driven by childhood scarcity even though your adult circumstances are different. Maybe you're repeating your parents' money patterns even though you consciously reject them. Seeing these patterns is painful. It's easier to stay focused on external tactics, on opportunities and strategies, because those don't require emotional work. But the emotional patterns are what determine whether tactics work. Avoiding the discomfort just means the patterns continue running your financial life from the shadows. Here's what the understanding phase actually involves: the specific practices that build the foundation for sustainable wealth growth. First, complete financial transparency with yourself. Track every dollar for at least 90 days, not to judge it, not to change it yet, just to see it. Where does money come from? Where does it go? When does it go there? What emotional states correlate with spending? What patterns repeat? This creates a data set that reveals your actual financial behavior, not what you think you do, but what you actually do. Most people are shocked by what they discover. The coffee and lunch money is almost never where the real leaks are. Real leaks are in the invisible recurring charges. the impulse purchases you don't remember making, the social obligations that drain hundreds monthly, the convenient spending that happens when you're tired or stressed. Second, emotional money mapping. This means connecting financial behaviors to emotional states and needs. When do you spend? What precedes spending episodes? What needs are you meeting with money that could be met other ways? This isn't about judgment or shame. It's about seeing the system clearly. Maybe you spend when anxious because your nervous system learned that acquiring things creates temporary relief. Maybe you avoid looking at accounts when stressed because your brain associates financial information with threat. Maybe you oscillate between restriction and excess because you never learned what healthy financial moderation feels like. Seeing these patterns doesn't fix them immediately, but you can't change what you can't see. The mapping comes first. Third, understanding your financial psychology baseline. What's your tolerance for risk? What's your actual relationship with delayed gratification? How do you handle financial complexity? What triggers financial anxiety? What creates financial confidence? These aren't good or bad traits, they're just your baseline. But knowing them determines what wealth-building strategies will actually work for you versus what will create constant friction. If you have low risk tolerance, aggressive investment strategies will cause anxiety that leads to poor decisions. If you have difficulty with delayed gratification, strategies that require years of patience will create suffering that eventually causes sabotage. The strategies themselves might be fine, but they have to match your psychology or they won't work regardless of their theoretical soundness. Fourth, systems auditing. Look at your existing financial systems or lack thereof. How do you make spending decisions? Is there a process or is it purely reactive? How do you handle bills and obligations? Is it organized or chaotic? How do you track net worth and progress? Do you even track it? How do you make investment decisions, research-based or emotion-based? How do you prevent lifestyle inflation? Is there a conscious system or does it just happen? Most people have almost no conscious systems. Money flows through their life reactively, driven by emotion and circumstance and unconscious patterns. Understanding the gaps in your systems shows you what needs to be built before growth can compound. Fifth, goal clarification and alignment. Most people have vague financial goals. Be wealthy or be comfortable or retire early without specific numbers or timelines or understanding of what those goals actually mean to them psychologically. Understanding money before growing it means getting brutally clear about what you actually want and why. Not what you should want, not what sounds impressive, what you actually want. Maybe you want freedom more than wealth. Maybe you want security more than growth. Maybe you want to build something more than you want to accumulate. Getting clear on this shapes every decision afterward. Chasing generic wealth without clarity about your actual goals is how people build money and still feel empty. After you've done this understanding work, and we're talking 3 to 6 months of dedicated attention, not forever, you have something most people never develop. You have a map of your financial system. You know where money goes and why. You know your patterns. You know your triggers. You know your psychology. You know your goals with clarity. Now, when you start trying to grow money, every strategy you choose can be aligned with this self-knowledge. You're not fighting yourself. You're working with yourself. That alignment is what lets growth compound. Here's what changes practically when understanding comes first. When you encounter an investment opportunity, you evaluate it not just on returns, but on whether it matches your risk tolerance and psychology. When you earn more money, you have systems to capture the gains instead of letting lifestyle inflation eat them. When you feel emotional about money, you have awareness to separate the emotion from the decision. When you experience setbacks, you have psychological foundation to stay consistent instead of panic selling or giving up. When you see progress, you have clarity about whether it's moving you toward your actual goals or just increasing numbers that don't matter to you. The people who skip this understanding phase and jump straight to growth, they're constantly surprised by their own behavior. They make money and spend it without meaning to. They know what they should do but can't seem to do it consistently. They understand investing intellectually but make emotional decisions anyway. They have goals but self-sabotage when getting close to achieving them. They work hard but progress feels harder than it should be. All of this comes from trying to build without foundation. All of it resolves when understanding comes first. Over decades, and this is the time frame that actually matters for wealth building, the difference is exponential. Someone who spent 6 months building understanding at the beginning might spend the next 30 years with aligned systems that capture and compound gains effortlessly. Someone who skipped that phase might spend 30 years fighting themselves, making progress and losing it, working hard for mediocre results. Same time invested, completely different experience and outcome. The 6 months of understanding wasn't delay, it was the only investment that mattered. What has to change mentally is the belief that action creates progress. Sometimes action creates chaos. Sometimes doing nothing except observing and understanding creates more value than a decade of uninformed activity. The shift is from outward focus to inward focus first, then outward. From Doing to being to doing better. From tactics to foundation to tactics that work. From knowledge about money to knowledge about yourself with money to using money aligned with that self-knowledge. This is difficult because our culture worships action and productivity and visible progress. Sitting with a spreadsheet tracking spending doesn't look like wealth building. Examining your emotional relationship with money doesn't feel like progress. But these invisible foundation activities determine whether all the visible activities work. The difficulty is accepting that understanding is action, that awareness is progress, that foundation is more valuable than tactics. Once you accept this, everything else becomes easier. The shift happens through commitment to self-knowledge before growth. You track spending with curiosity, not judgment. You examine patterns with honesty, not shame. You map emotional triggers with compassion, not criticism. You audit systems with clarity about what's missing. You clarify goals with honesty about what you actually want. This takes 3 to 6 months of dedicated attention, not forever, not a lifetime, just enough time to see clearly what's actually happening in your financial life and why. Then you can build on foundation instead of sand. So here's what we've covered. Understanding money before trying to grow it isn't optional preparation. It's the actual foundation that determines whether growth compounds or leaks away. Most people skip this because it feels slow, unsexy, not actionable enough. But the people who build lasting wealth all go through this understanding phase, consciously or unconsciously. They develop self-knowledge about their patterns, triggers, psychology, systems, goals. That self-knowledge shapes everything else. Growth built on this foundation compounds. Growth built without it creates cycles of progress and sabotage. This means that 6 months spent understanding yourself might be worth more than 10 years of uninformed action. The time invested in mapping your system, seeing your patterns, addressing your emotional relationship with money, building conscious systems aligned with your psychology, this creates the conditions for effortless compound growth. Without this foundation, you're fighting yourself constantly, making progress harder than it needs to be, limiting outcomes regardless of knowledge or effort. Understanding is the first step and the most important step. The change comes from valuing invisible foundation over visible tactics, from knowing yourself before trying to outsmart markets, from building systems before chasing opportunities. It's not about working harder. It's about seeing clearly what's actually happening so you can work with yourself instead of against yourself. Wealth isn't about finding the perfect strategy. It's about building the psychological foundation that lets any reasonable strategy work. The people who understand money before trying to grow it don't need perfect tactics because they've eliminated the internal barriers that make tactics fail. Their wealth builds from alignment and awareness, not from external cleverness. And that kind of wealth, built on self-knowledge and conscious systems, compounds effortlessly and lasts. If you value calm, educational explanations about money and wealth psychology, consider subscribing to Wealth Explained 360.